iti te rā, ka mahara ke I toko renga, ka tangi te manu, nui a tāne, hoki atu rā ki te pō kere kere, e rangi nui, mana ki tia mai rā, I te tōtara, o te ariki e papa, tangi ara me he moana,
In regards to the Pacific pay gap, if you were to take a look at the statistics, it's actually quite shameful, the gap that exists between, in particular, Pacific women and everybody else. I actually don't think Pacific people realise how big the gap actually is. I know a lot of Pacific people who have been too afraid to negotiate what they think they're worth and have given that power to someone else. I think pay transparency could help, because basically it requires you to be transparent about what the baseline actually is for particular roles. And until you know that, you're kind of going into these roles blindly. If we're thinking about systemic changes, once again it starts from the top, and the government having to be the example and having to provide a level of standard or perhaps mandated standards or even introducing legislation. I think it's important for Pacific workers to get involved in the Pacific Pay Gap inquiry. It's an opportunity for them to voice what has been happening. It's an opportunity for them to know that they're not alone. Definitely a great opportunity for us to do something better, to be better in this space. For me, to be involved in the Pacific Pay Gap inquiry, it's always an honour and a privilege to be able to be trusted to hold the voices of people who have experienced some quite challenging experiences in their workplace, and it's an opportunity for us to honour those who took the risk to be able to come here to be able to build legacy for their family.
I definitely believe that I have experienced pay discrimination on the basis of my race, but the tricky thing is that there's a lack of transparency around pay and around other contractual arrangements, which may make it hard to explain or to prove to someone who hasn't experienced this discrimination. But for many Pacific and for many Māori and minority communities, it's an instinctual feeling that we have that we're being taken advantage of. And it's also a very tough thing to talk about with the employer because culturally we've been raised to be very humble and to not put ourselves forward or to not demand more than what we're given. So it's a very tough space in terms of appreciating what different types of employees bring. For Pacific peoples, we're often asked to carry the burden of a lot of cultural labour, unorthodox types of skills that workplaces appreciate and workplaces expect and need, but they seem to be valued less. So I think if we transform the way that we think about skills, we think about what Pacific peoples are worth in terms of what they bring to workplaces, then we can go about addressing and closing that pay gap. I think the inquiry is absolutely crucial and necessary at this point in time. It always has been, but especially now where we're seeing, due largely to the pandemic, a lot of our youth are having to forego their education, having to leave school in order to take up work to help support their families. And that's a result of not only rising costs of living, but inadequate wages that our people are being paid. It's a serious impact on their future and their ability to provide not only for themselves, but their own families So it's important for our kids, for our children, that we take action now. I think one of the most important systemic changes that we need to see is pay transparency legislation, where we can actually identify gaps within workplaces between employees that are Pacific and non-Pacific, and also along gender lines as well. Also to have accountability mechanisms for employers who aren't paying their employees equally along the lines of race and gender. So having that be put on the table and being championed by the Human Rights Commission and other key stakeholders will be incredibly important to addressing and closing the pay gap.
I think pay transparency and understanding what that progression path is, I think is something that what I see younger workers are looking for, and that needs to be something that just becomes normative across the employment market. When I was previously Chief Executive of Auckland Tourism Events and Economic Development, we felt it was really important that when people came in, we gave them a sense of where they were in a band, and so being a bit more transparent about it. Of course, a lot of people that come into employment may not have that detailed knowledge, and that's why I think having more education for people entering the workforce around that, maybe some guides about what are the questions that you're okay to ask. Because in many cases, people are just grateful for a job, and it's not till they start on the job they realise, well, hang on a minute here, I'm doing the same job as that person, but I seem to be being paid less, or there's some sort of arrangement here. So I think equipping them with that knowledge and the right questions to ask would be a really good start. To make good decisions, you need good data. So the more we can be collecting that data, hopefully without it being too onerous, because New Zealand's made up of thousands of very small businesses, and they don't necessarily have the same ability as other businesses to provide that data. But so long as we get past that threshold, and again be transparent about it, be open about it, so that we can see over the next few years how we are managing to close that gap, whether it's by ethnicity or by gender, then I think that's a good thing. The pay gap itself and closing it will be a measure that you'll be able to use as a bit of a barometer for other improvements that we're likely to see as a result of that. And so that's the big prize for us all here. It's that we end up with businesses that have a much more engaged workforce, that are much more productive. They're closing the gap because they're acquiring more skills, and all of those things are good long term for New Zealand. I think for young people who are really accustomed to transparency and they want to see that data, it's almost essential. And I think you'll start to see sort of a differentiation between employers that are open and willing to provide that sort of information versus those that are not. So again, that's a powerful incentive. Retaining and developing people is going to be one of our biggest challenges in the next 10 or 20 years. Declining natural population growth, lots of change and disruption going on in business means that holding on to people is going to be really, really critical, and pay transparency will be a big part of that.
For me, I think racial discrimination and harassment are the ones that kind of resonate the most. I remember when I was first a law graduate, lots of what we'd call now microaggressions from colleagues. And I distinctly remember it was about 20 of us graduates sitting in quite a small space together. So we were in each other's space all the time. And for some reason they were talking about us being a family. And then they said, "Oh, but Lisa, you're the help." I just thought, wow, I was the only Pacific person in that cohort of graduates. And yeah, it really affected me, knowing that my peers viewed me that way, but also the fact that, the supervisor never intervened. She never said anything. And I actually did raise it as an issue with the partners of the firm in a letter. and they just never responded. At the time, there was talk about sexual harassment. There was quite a lot of talk about it. This was 10 years ago. And then more recently, there's been all the talk, the Me Too movement and particularly sexual harassment around certain big firms. And I felt that as a young Pacific woman, racial harassment was actually far more of an issue for me than sexual harassment. I have experienced sexual harassment, but for me, the racial harassment was far greater an issue. And I've always kind of thought that, when's that issue going to come to the fore? When are we going to talk about racial harassment? I think there's a growing awareness of racism generally. Obviously there was the Black Lives Matter movement last year. There's long been treaty rights and movements around rights of tangata whenua, but there is still that hesitance around, I don't want to be seen to be raising the race card. I think it's about, number one, recognising it for what it is, and number two, supporting each other to have those conversations. And then number three, I think it's about employers being willing to listen and being willing to hear that your staff member might feel minoritised or racially harassed or culturally unsafe. We do hear that Pacific people are humble, and we hear that both from non-Pacific people and Pacific people themselves. But I would actually challenge that, because the other thing that we're hearing through the inquiry is that when Pacific workers do get the confidence to challenge equal pay issues, such as where they are being paid less than a colleague with exactly the same qualification and experience, when they raise that issue with their manager, they're told to mind their own business, to lump it or leave it. Why is that person being paid $5,000 less than their colleague with exactly the same skills and experience in the first place? That's actually on the employer, It's actually unlawful. It's already unlawful. But I think that employers need to look at themselves and challenge their biases and think about, what is it that makes them think that a Pacific person is worth less? I think it's the perfect time for us to be having this conversation. I think it's long overdue. Nobody wants to be called a racist, right? I understand that. But you do have to really challenge yourself. And I think you can start with the easy stuff like measuring ethnicity. Sometimes we meet with employers and they say, there's no ethnic pay gap here. And we say, okay, well, how do you know that? And they say, we think there isn't one, and it's clear that they haven't actually measured it. What are our values as a society? What kind of world do we want for each other and for our children? And do we want that to be one where all people, regardless of their ethnicity, can live with dignity, can have enough to provide for their children, have a decent home to live in, feel fulfilled by their jobs? Or do we want what's happening now, which is there's an increasingly a large segment of society who are the working poor, and they're struggling every day, and that's actually not good for them, and that's actually not good for all of us. We have some ideas about solutions, but we don't have all the answers, and we do need to hear from Pacific workers to make sure that what we're saying works in the real world and isn't just going to be another report or another policy document. We really do need to also hear from our MVP FAF Plus community and our disability community. We don't want this to just be about Pacific professional men or specific groups of us who might already carry some privilege. We do want to hear from groups who do have extra barriers. We're not one group, we're not all Samoan as I am, or all Tongan, or whatever it might be. There is a diversity amongst Pacific peoples, and so we do want to really hear from that diversity from the diverse groups within Pacific.
The Pacific pay gap is the difference between the highest income earners in New Zealand and the lowest income earners, and the lowest income earners are Pacific peoples. Everyone has a right to a life of dignity. You know, we have a right to an adequate standard of living, but we know that Pacific children are overrepresented in the child poverty figures. If we're looking at people who are struggling to afford homes, struggle rents, Pacific people are concentrated, they're overrepresented. So for us to close this gap, we really need to address these inequities, and that is why we're doing this pay inquiry. We are going to focus on three main industries: manufacturing, health and construction. So if you're in those sectors, we are really keen to hear from you. If you're not in those sectors and you still want to talk to us, please contact us, because we want solutions as well as wanting to understand. And then those solutions and those recommendations we will then hand on to government, as well as talk to businesses so that they have some good practice to learn from. But we also want to build an understanding amongst our Pacific people that you are worth it. Anyone who defines themselves as a Pacific person can get involved. I have heard from Pacific people who are CEOs. I've heard about builders being paid unequally, laborers being paid unequally. You know, if you've been passed over for promotion, or if you've discovered that you've been paid equally and the system hasn't supported you, I'm interested in that too. It matters now because our people are suffering. It matters now because New Zealand is not upholding its duty to ensure adequate living standards for all of our peoples. Poverty is not inevitable. Inequality is socially constructed. It is our duty as a government, as a society, to lift everybody up. This is about you, this is about your children, your life. You belong in New Zealand, and you deserve the very best that this country can offer you. Contact us and talk to us.
Ho tia te rito, if you pluck out the heart. Ho tia te rito o te harakeke, if you pluck out the heart of the flax bush. Kei hea te komako e ko, then where will the bellbird perch? Ki mai ki ahau, ask me then. He aha te mea nui, ask me what is the greatest thing. Ask me what is the greatest thing in the world. Maki e ki atu. He tangata, he tangata, he tangata. It is people, it is people, it is people. It is done. Kamusta, hello, tēnā koutou. Very warm Pacific greetings from Aotearoa New Zealand down in the Pacific. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you're joining us from. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today, and very warm welcome to you. My name is Saunoamaali'i Karanina Sumeo. I am the Equal Employment Opportunities Commissioner for the Human Rights Commission here in New Zealand. And it is my absolute honor to be here today with our esteemed panelists, who I will introduce to you very soon. I'll just give you a little bit of a journey. I've been watching some of our webinars through the CSW week last week and through this week, looking at the issue of pay equity and equal pay. And so we've been watching the progress of what's happening globally. But I'll just give you a little bit of background about New Zealand's journey on this. We've got an Equal Pay Act 1972. So a lot of work has happened along this journey for New Zealand to achieve and realize pay equity and equal pay. Unfortunately, despite the Act, as others have experienced around the world, despite the laws, we are not experiencing yet equal pay and pay equity for women. And as in New Zealand, as in elsewhere, women are not equal amongst themselves. And I'm hoping that today's discussion will be able to delve a bit more about some of that and what we're hoping to do for our peoples. But I just want to acknowledge all the work of our women's groups, our businesses, our advocates, our unions, through this whole journey for Aotearoa New Zealand specifically. This is not a movement that happened 2 years ago or 6 months ago. So I just want to acknowledge all of our champions, and some of them have passed on, and we are still we're still putting up, advocating and fighting for this to be realized. As in the video we said, fundamental rights. We all have the right to equal employment opportunity, to pay equity, to have an adequate standard of living for ourselves and our families. And to work in workplaces that are safe and free from discrimination. These are fundamental human rights that we all have. The Human Rights Commission back in 2019 launched a campaign and lobbied the government to bring in pay transparency. So this has been a journey for us. It's now 2022, and we have worked alongside our unions, our women's groups, our advocates, a few of our corporates, and other civil society and community groups. So it's been a bit of a movement for us, and we're very excited to share that journey with you today. And in terms of the progress, just last month in February 2022, the Commission submitted our petition for pay transparency to the New Zealand government, and it has been received warmly. And at this point in time, we understand that there's been general support for this to happen. How that happens for New Zealand, we hope to also contribute to that conversation in due course with our people in Parliament. But one of the key things that came out of our pay transparency campaign was the decision to focus on the ethnic group that was paid the least in New Zealand, and that is Pacific peoples. So Aotearoa New Zealand is in the Pacific Ocean, it's in the Pacific region, and yet amongst that, people who are indigenous to the Pacific region who live in Aotearoa New Zealand are struggling. And we don't know why that is. So we have launched this inquiry, and we hope to complete the inquiry this year. And I'm happy to talk more about that. So that's a little bit about our journey here in New Zealand. And as I said, I've been keeping an eye on the other webinars that happened this week, but we're very excited to be with you and join in today. One of the issues that we've got in New Zealand is we have the Equal Pay Act, as I said before, but unfortunately, it only has the ground of sex upon which you can make pay equity claims. It does not include ethnicity or disability or nation of origin or any of the other grounds that are forbidden for discrimination here in our country. So there's a bit of a disalignment there that we want to work on. But certainly in terms of the pay gap, for those of you not from New Zealand, the average gender pay gap, and I use the word average purposely, is around 9 or 10%, between 9 and 10%, depending on which data you look at. But if you look at women in senior executive levels, the gap is significantly bigger, around the 30 percentile. So that is huge. Now, the problem with looking at averages, as we know, is that it clouds out the reality and the much bigger inequities for women who aren't the average. And so the average here is generally our Pākehā sisters. I'll use the word our white sisters here, our Pākehā sisters, European sisters. And beneath the average, we have our other sisters from other parts, particularly Asia and the Pacific. And the biggest gap is with Pacific women. It's around 25, 27%. That is the pay gap for Pacific women here in New Zealand. So I'll just stop talking there. So that just gives you a bit of an understanding about the picture that we've got. So as I said, we've been watching the developments overseas. I watched a webinar a couple of days ago, or not very long ago, where we heard from Switzerland and Ontario and Germany and the UK and others about their experience. So we are watching very closely what you're doing there. But that's enough for me in terms of the work that we're doing. I'm now going to I'll introduce our panelists as we go. And for your information, it occurred to me this morning that each one of our panelists have been people who've come to make New Zealand our home. So it's a very personal journey for us. And I feel like we're also outnumbered by our Filipino brother and sister here. which is really exciting. So I'll introduce our first speaker, Maretha Smith. She is a great ally for human rights, for equal opportunities, and for women, but generally for all peoples. So Maretha has come from South Africa. She's leads our DiversityWorks organization here, and I'll let her tell you a little bit about DiversityWorks. So and some of the exciting work and some exciting new research that's come out of there that will contribute to our quest for pay transparency. So over to you, Maretha.
Kia ora, Karanina. Thank you very much, Talofa Lafa. It is fantastic for me to be on this panel this morning. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share some of our work and some of our findings and some research that we've done recently with this panel. Quick overview of just what we are and who we are as an organisation. DiversityWorks New Zealand was established in 1992 as the Equal Employment Opportunities Trust. As such, we were working a lot in organisations. We're a membership-based organisation, work with organisations specifically around training to assist them in their journeys around a more inclusive workplace for everybody. So over the years, we've done lots of training in those organisations, and we've seen how the landscape around this corridor of diversity and inclusion has just matured significantly in our country. And we are starting to shift our focus to what I would call to knit this ecosystem together better and to contribute more effectively through some research and through setting standards of what good looks like, to help organizations to understand how they benchmark against others. So really to start playing a much more strategic role in these journeys of organizations and in general in the conversations that are happening through us and through some of our advocacy partners. So what we've seen over the last, I would say probably the last 2 years specifically, is this escalation of the conversation around pay gaps and pay transparency, and obviously led by you, Saunoamaali'i, around how can we get more transparency in our ecosystem to help close those gaps. We've looked at what was available in the system in terms of disability, in terms of Pacific, in terms of Māori, in terms of women. There was a lot that was already available in terms of data sets. And we wanted to contribute quite effectively to this conversation. And we thought the piece of information that we don't yet have is one around migrant pay gap. And here we are specifically looking at those who are not born in the country. We're not looking at ethnicity because, as you know, people from different areas can identify ethnically in many different ways. But the way in which we cut the data, there definitely is some conclusions that we can draw where country of birth could be used as a proxy to a certain extent for ethnicity. And I won't say that to our data analysts, they won't like me saying that. But yeah, so there are some interesting conclusions that we can draw from that. So I would like to show just a few slides because I think that makes for interesting context as we are heading into this conversation today. Just some of the findings that we've had in terms of country of birth, just to show we are saying that there isn't pay transparency. Actually, the data shows quite transparently this is what we know anecdotally have been the lived experience of many of our people from different ethnic communities. So if you may, I will quickly share, where's my share screen? That screen. And I hope that that's available for everybody to see. Just all good? Great. So we commissioned this migrant pay gap research at the beginning of last year. And we looked at the data sets, the IDI data set, which is an overlay of the census data. We looked at 2013 and 2018, census data from Stats New Zealand, and we looked at data from the IRD and from data from MB, the Ministry for Business Innovation and Employment. And we start out with a hypothesis that there will be an overall migrant pay gap. And we've seen through the International Labour Organization that when this research was done in European countries, they clearly found that there was a gap between migrants and non-migrants. So we started off with that hypothesis that we will find a pay gap. What is really, really interesting is that we haven't found one. Overall pay gap in New Zealand between people born in the country and people not born in the country is pretty much similar. There is no overall pay gap. However, when we started drilling into country of birth, an incredibly stark picture started emerging. And that is the one that I think is starting to show us where we need to start our focus when we talk about pay gaps. We saw that if you see on the left hand, and you will see the 2013 is, the orange is 2013, and the turquoise teal color is 2018. On the left-hand side of the scale, we have all of our European countries. We've got Australia, we've got South Africa, we've got United Kingdom, Ireland, Northern Europe, Middle East, Western Europe, not Middle East, Western Europe, all of those on the left-hand side of the scale with a positive pay gap to the average in New Zealand. If we then look at the right-hand side of the scale, we see countries coming through like India, Central America, South America, Central Asia, Melanesia, Polynesia, Northeast Asia, China, Korea, those countries. And those are countries of birth of people with a negative pay gap to the average in New Zealand. It begs the question why, and clearly there are some questions to be answered around types of occupation, types of qualifications, those kinds of things. But just as a picture, different migrants have different experiences. And where you are born, it definitely has an impact in terms of your experience here. And especially when we see in terms of shifts for Northeast Asia, Micronesia, and mainland Southeast China, that has even worsened over from census to census. When we just look at migrants from Polynesia, they've earned $1.81 less than those that were born in New Zealand. And when we talk about Polynesia, we're specifically talking about Samoan, Tongan, and Fijian migrants, and they all earned a lower average wage than the non-migrants. Those are the ones that I just mentioned. When we look at the intersectionality, migrants and sex, what was really interesting is, again, when we look at Polynesia, Maritime Southeast Asia, China, and India, they have a lower gender gap between male and female than what we would see in the United Kingdom, North America, and South Africa. And that begs the question, what is it that we are importing in terms of a pay gap? And how do we look at global equity and how we treat people who choose to make New Zealand their home? Very interesting, again, when we look at migrants and language, what we saw is that for those migrants, when we look at English only, we saw that migrants from Polynesia and China get a higher pay than those who have English and another language, which is interesting because all of the other migrants from other territories are not being penalized for being bilingual. But when you are migrating from Polynesia and China, you are being penalized from a pay perspective for being bilingual. And then in terms of ethnicity and qualification, when we look at those, and this is a very, very busy slide, but when we look at migrants from Australia and from Korea, So if we just look at the difference between migrants from Australia and Korea in terms of higher qualifications, Australia has got the highest pay, whereas migrants from Korea is the lowest in terms of higher qualifications. And if we look at no qualification, what we see is that those migrants from Samoa, Tongan, Cook Islands Maori, and Fijian, actually no qualifications, they earn higher rates than the rest, other than the Dutch. So that was interesting because what we then can establish there is that when it comes to no qualification labor, actually our people from Polynesia are are earning well, not well, but comparatively well, but they don't get any recognition in terms of higher qualifications. The moment, and to your point a bit earlier, Saunoamaali'i, the moment that we start looking at higher level roles, higher qualifications, they get penalized for those roles. So that's just a very, very quick overview of some of the findings in terms of the research on migrant pay gap. And I think that gives us a sense of gravity around where we see some of the inequities. There definitely are some structural issues that we need to look at, but there clearly are some bias and discrimination that we also need to look at. And when we look at pay transparency, there definitely is something that can propel us forward in terms of having those conversations and closing those gaps. So thank you very much for that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And this is exciting work for New Zealand because it's the first time that this has been done, that we're getting this look around pay inequities in relation to nation of origin. So thank you very much, Maretha. So we're now going to move on to our brother Dennis, who is the first New Zealander of Asian descent to lead a major trade union. And I thought I'd invite Dennis along because of what they're seeing in terms of pay inequity and the impact of pay secrecy on our people here who are on temporary work visas and are not permanent residents. So there's your opening, Dennis. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Morena, Saunoamaali'i, and greetings to everyone, and allow me to greet you with my native tongue, Mabuhay. Again, thank you for inviting me and being part of this discussion. Look, when I was looking at the videos, different kinds of perspectives, including the presentation of Maretha, I really appreciated about the in-depth discussions and level of discussions that we're having right now, because if ever I go back 15 years ago, this was never even actually discussed publicly. It's like a taboo when you actually discuss about the ethnicity, when you discuss about pay transparency. I remember when I started doing my job as an organizer, and every time I say to the worker that, hey, feel free to discuss about your pay or your wage. And the biggest fear at that time was that I can't, because if ever I share this information, I could actually lose my job. And I said, why? Because part of my employment contract is not to disclose my wage with other employee. And other employers were actually using that as a way to intimidate workers not to share their income or not to share their wage or even actually payslip. And at that time, I was saying to myself, this is really unfair. And that is the reason why we've been campaigning for this, that aside from gender, there should also be ethnicity. And let me discuss my perspective about this. If ever you look at the immigration stats or even actually the actual workforce, the labor market, in our union, 60% of our membership, they are Pacifica workers. And many of them are working in a low-paid job. And that's the reason why we are campaigning actually for a big fix, because we would like to correct the labor market and say to the employer that's about time that you have to value their jobs. And what we have noticed for a long time, for more than a decade, there are businesses out there who are conscious about browning their workforce. I know that term will be controversial, but browning their workforce, it is actually very evident that many employers rely on overseas workers to do the dirty, dangerous, and difficult jobs. And I think in the research and in the focus of this discussion, you look at the manufacturing, the health sector, and the construction. And I'm telling you this based on my experience. Being a Filipino and leader of this second biggest private sector union in New Zealand, would you believe that I've been approached several times by several HR companies, and they thought that we're like a recruiting agency. They would like to employ more Filipinos and Indians in their workforce. And I said, why? I couldn't understand why, but when I started asking about the pay, I can see why, because browning workforce means actually accessing cheap and docile labor. Because if ever you are on a temporary visa, how would you be able to negotiate your pay? The only time that a migrant worker a brown person can actually negotiate their pay is every time they renew their work visa. And the way they do it is that, hey, I have to change or I have to negotiate for my pay. Otherwise, I'm not going to meet the immigration threshold. And that was the only time. Now that the labor market is changing, because there is actually a big shortage right now, migrants and other ethnic groups have now the capacity to negotiate because there's actually a high demand. But this is only a temporary situation. Once the labor market and we open up the border again, then it might actually go back pre-pandemic settings. And if ever we go back to pre-pandemic settings, we're going to be facing the same problem, this ethnicity, this browning of workforce. And one thing that I would like also to share is that in my experience here, one thing that I'm really appalled, I'm aware that there are companies out there who actually recruit those top managers from overseas. Despite the fact that there are many talents in New Zealand, especially from chief executive level down to supervisor level, you can actually nurture those talents. And I can understand why a lot of our Pacifica workers, every time that we discuss that, hey, we need to step up, we need to be in that position as well, we need to look after our people. Every time they negotiate for their wages, they thought that, hey, I'm not in the position to be in that job, to be in that managerial position, because they have this stigma that this is actually designed for Pakia, or this is designed for highly intellectuals, and we are not part of it. It's becoming part of the culture, but we have to break that stigma. We have to break that. And every time those workers fail to negotiate, it also actually creates social trauma to them, to the point that they never raise that issue again. And that's the reason why the union movement and the rest of those social or the civil society organizations have actually a role to play here, how to encourage and how to actually break that stigma, that is not the case. And the way we can actually do this is that if ever we have a pay transparency, because we should also expose the structural arrangement within the workplace. And I tell you, once we have this legislative framework, there are many information that will come out in public. And that's why I don't actually disagree that every time there is, for example, a vacancy or available jobs out there, that even the wages available, if ever they're actually meeting the labor market. So those are the things that how we can actually address that. And I also don't believe that the wages or the payslip should actually be hidden amongst their workmates. It's about time that we have to break that practice. Some of them just calling that favoritism, but I believe, in my observation, that we have a problem of structural discrimination. We have a problem about conscious and unconscious bias towards other ethnicity. We have actually a problem looking at women as leaders of the workplace. These are the things that we have to be discussing publicly like this one, and to be consistent about that. But we also have to actually look for some action points and legislative framework to address that, because otherwise it will be a systemic problem that from now, 2022, I don't want to have another discussion like this in 2032. All right, it's about time. There is now actually a framework to do this. We have to encourage our people. We have actually to create that pathway. We have to break the stigma. And it's also about time that we have to tell those businesses or organizations that we have to create a space and opportunities for New Zealanders in this country. That's it from me, Saunoamaali'i.
Saunoamaali'i, brother, very, very powerful. I mean, it's we've got to lift the problem up and take the onus, the weight of the person who is suffering, and put it back on our businesses and on government to provide those structures to address the systemic. It is a systemic issue. So for Tailava, I'll now hand over to Nina Santos. She is the delivery manager for MindTheGap.nz, a campaign championing mandated gender and ethnic gap reporting. And Nina, over to you. So welcome to the discussion. This is probably just for those who are not in New Zealand and those who are here and I may not be aware. We're not good at developing tools to help pay transparency. So this is quite a significant step for the movement in New Zealand. So go for it, Nina.
Kia ora, mabuhay. Thank you, Saunoamaali'i. And I want to acknowledge fellow panelists as well. I deeply resonate with what you've just presented, especially as a young migrant woman. And I think I want to start by acknowledging my parents, really, who I think are watching, as well as my friends and colleagues, especially my parents, because I know as first-generation migrants, they've experienced this firsthand, and they've done all they can to make sure that I don't. But unfortunately, with the way that it is, with the state of the pay gaps, I'm preparing myself for a slice of the pay gap pie, which is almost unacceptable in 2022. So I'm here today in my capacity as delivery manager for Mind the Gap. And I just want to take you through what the campaign is all about and also what we want and what you can do after this presentation. So you may have seen us around. We've strived to be everywhere in that visibility. And thanks to our allied organizations like the unions, First Union and the Human Rights Commission and DiversityWorks, they're allied organizations. And what I've learned in this role is that it takes a lot to push the envelope. And I came into it, as a very idealistic young person, and I was like, let's do this. But in the last 6 months, I have realized how difficult it is to create change and to push for legislative reform. And the collective energy that the Human Rights Commission and that the unions have created is pivotal in making this change happen. So Mind the Gap. The thing is that the context is that pay gaps persist. And whilst there's been a lot of noise around gender pay gaps in recent years, the intersectionality aspect is often missing. And that's disappointing and problematic because ethnic women bear the brunt of pay gaps in New Zealand. So in this graph, a very simplified graph, you'll see that out of all groups in New Zealand, Pacifica women actually find themselves as the lowest earning income group. And we have the data for Asian and Maori women as well. But looking at the wider context, there's very disaggregated data for other ethnicities. And again, I hate the word other, but it is the reality. There's very limited data, which makes it very hard. So if you can't measure that number, it's actually very hard to change it. So that's part of the whole culture of pay secrecy and the whole culture of pay gap secrecy. So Mind the Gap is essentially a pay gap transparency campaign. There's a whole picture for pay transparency, which the HRC have done a beautiful job of working towards. And what we're doing is kind of biting off a piece of the big elephant. So we're calling for mandated pay gap reporting. So we want it to be required for larger employers in New Zealand. And sometimes it sounds really boring, pay gap reporting. Why does this matter? But the simple thing is that pay gap reporting works. So in a lot of countries like Australia and the United Kingdom, big businesses are actually required by the government to disclose their pay gaps. And it's worked wonders, right? International evidence shows us that, for example, in the UK, the requirement of pay gap reporting has reduced the gaps by about 19%. 90% in context is a huge number. That imagine an extra 19% on top of your current pay packet. That's how big of a difference it makes. So we know it works, but the problem is there's no requirement for any organization in New Zealand to measure or report their pay gaps. So what we've noticed so far, it's either businesses say, we don't have a gap. We care about diversity. We care about inclusion, all these wonderful sprinkly things. Or they say, it's either we don't have a gap or we've tried measuring, but the data doesn't actually tell us anything. And because there is no requirement for them to do so, there's nothing pushing them to actually measure the data. So it's all very secretive and it's all very keep your cards close to your chest. And that's benefiting no one apart from the employer. Because the culture of pay secrecy and pay gap secrecy just makes pay gaps worse, right? So the Mind the Gap campaign recently launched a public pay gap registry. I think it's the first in New Zealand, but also the first in the world to take into account the ethnic aspect of pay gaps. The pay gap registry is like a big list of 165 of New Zealand's largest businesses. And for the first time ever, you can see which businesses report their pay gaps for gender, Maori, and Pacific people. And this is huge, right? So for the last 6 months, we've been working with a lot of businesses to take them on a journey. Because you can imagine, pay gaps are not a number businesses would like to disclose, because in most cases, it's embarrassingly huge. And we have had businesses who are like, okay, we're not ready to reveal this yet. Let us work on it first before revealing it. Again, part of the problem. And what we've found with the launch of the pay gap registry is that there's clear momentum in reporting. So businesses like the big 4 accounting firms have committed to gender pay gap reporting, but only 7 or 6 businesses in New Zealand are reporting their pay gaps for Maori and Pacific people. So it doesn't only need specific encouragement, but it also highlights the problem of the lack of data. So like I said, there is very, very limited or disaggregated data for ethnic pay gaps. And that just goes to show how, it's great, it's building momentum and we're talking about it now. But traditionally and historically, this, like Dennis said, it has been a taboo. No one wants to talk about the ethnic aspect of things because that requires people to confront their biases and to confront the discrimination. And, unfortunately, the fragility of some Pākehā people and some organizations stop that from happening. I saw this really brilliant meme. It was a meme on Instagram that said, if it's not intersectional, it's not good enough. It's essentially trash, right? An example of that, a piece of law that isn't working, is the Equal Pay Act. Like Karanina said, the current law in New Zealand that's meant to protect people from getting unequal pay and that's meant to prevent pay gaps doesn't say anything about ethnicity. It doesn't say anything about disabilities. It doesn't say anything about other gender diverse communities. So, you can see why, like, the Equal Pay Act is actually turning 50 in October this year, which is, a perfect opportunity to highlight how the act is not good enough. It's not working. And in my work with MindTheGap, so just checking time, we've seen a lot of resistance in social media for pay gaps. And there are a lot of pay gap deniers out there, people who say like, actually give me an example of, someone who is getting paid less for the same role. You can't, because it's illegal. And our response to that is always, just because it hasn't happened to you doesn't mean it's not happening to other people, Pacifica, our Pacifica community, our Maori community, our ethnic communities who don't have the bargaining power to negotiate or to talk about pay, because there is a certain level of privilege that's needed to have these discussions, right? So it is just a reality. And one of the last few things I want to highlight is pay gaps, ethnic pay gaps in particular. It's more than just the money. It's not just about unequal pay, for example, unequal pay for the same roles. It's a whole labor market segregation issue. It's the fact that we devalue certain roles, we devalue migrants, we devalue brown people who go into these specific roles. We take advantage of in their vulnerabilities, like Dennis said. The bondage nature of work visas makes it very hard for migrants to talk about pay. It makes it very hard for migrants to demand for more. And I know this firsthand because I'm a migrant. My family is a migrant. Actually, being in this role is a privilege. Being able to talk about pay and equity now, I do acknowledge the privilege I hold, because a lot of migrants, I think, are not and won't be in that position because they're just worried about their families, and that will always come first. So that puts a lot of the responsibility, and I think we should shift the burden of pushing for change to Pākehā and people with privilege, because we can't leave it to people who don't have that privilege. And also, like it's been mentioned a couple of times, bias and discrimination are drivers of the pay gap. Another common pay gap denier line is that, pay gaps are due to like educational differences or like experience. Experience is a favorite word, like, but research actually shows that the pay gaps, like educational attainment, experience, skills, those only account for about 20% of the total gap. So the 80% is missing. It can only be attributed, I think, in part to the bias and discrimination in organizations and to firm behavior. So that's why pay gap reporting is very important. You know, pay gap transparency, requiring businesses to report on their gaps, is a small but significant change. And we know this from overseas. And if it's made into law, New Zealand will be world leading, because countries like the UK, I think, only report on the gender pay gaps. So the ethnic aspect is very much missing. Okay, I think I only have 30 seconds left. My ask to everyone on this webinar right now, if you're in a position and if you have the power and the confidence to do so, please ask about pay gaps. It's important we keep this conversation going. So you don't have to ask your boss. I know that's very hard, and pay is a very awkward taboo topic. But you can ask businesses you encounter. You can ask businesses you pay you pay your bills to every month. Ask your power company, ask your bank, ask your lawyer, ask businesses you support and you encounter. Ask the business you buy your clothes from. What are your pay gaps? Are men and women and our ethnic groups paid equally, or do you treat your employees fairly? Because what we know, what we've found throughout the campaign is that employees actually value the reputation. So it's becoming more and more of like a factor, an encouraging factor to report on their gaps and to address their gaps. Otherwise, they'll lose consumers. So yeah, that's it. MindTheGap.nz for more information. And also, when you hear this phrase, pay gap reporting, from now on, just keep in mind that it is an important step we can take, but it's an important step, but it's not the silver bullet. We're calling on government to legislate this and make this into law, because only about 50 businesses are reporting their gender pay gaps, and very, very few for Modern Pacifica. So that law change will really, I think, is needed to deliver the wide change that New Zealand needs. Thank you.
Excellent. Salamat, Nina. Thank you very much for sharing the tool with us. I'm scared of you already. Okay. Can I invite now Kat from the Human Rights Commission to perhaps flag some of the questions. Well, introduce yourself, Kat, and then flag some of the questions that have come up and give it to our panel to respond and share some thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, kia ora and welcome to everybody who's watching. Thank you to the amazing panelists, very passionate, experienced people, incredible insight. So we've had a few questions come through. For those of you who haven't used the Q&A function yet, at the bottom on the toolbar, you'll see a number of options, and one says Q&A. So you're welcome to just put in any questions there and we'll get them through to the panelists to answer. So we'll just get started. It's directed to you, Maretha, but I think, probably any of the panelists could also contribute, but we'll just start with you. There's a question about what better pay conditions can we see for the lower end of the income scale? So if we were to see a shift in perhaps minimum or living wage policies, how could that impact better pay conditions for people at the lower end of an income scale? So if you want to go for that.
Thank you, Kat. Yes, and I've just seen in the chat that I think that I've shared the wrong screen. I haven't shared my full slide presentation screen. I've shared the one that didn't show you the slides in full. So apologies for that, but I'll make the slides available afterwards. I think what I've seen in the chat was the question around those better pay conditions at the lower end of the income scale, and whether that was as a result of minimum and living wage policies. And maybe if I can just reflect on that. I think from the data set that we have, I wouldn't see those the minimum wage impacting on any specific group. The minimum wage will be impacting across the broad range for all of the groups. So in 2018, the minimum wage was $16.50. And if we then look at that data, the 2018 data for the group of not qualified group, the group from Africa was the lowest. And the migrants from Polynesia, if we look at Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga, they were the second highest in the no qualifications category. I think the point that I wanted to make in relation to this was that it shows actually what we value. And when it comes to people from our Polynesian territories, we value a safe pair of hands at entry levels of the business. But we actually don't value the leadership or the specialist roles that they can bring in terms of that might require higher qualifications. And this might be, on the one hand, an issue of systemic bias. So if we look at the trade space, there might be issues around what qualifications get recognized by professional registration bodies. But when it comes to academic qualifications, there's definitely something in terms of the picture being painted around discrimination and prejudice and bias.
Thank you so much. Kind of, I guess, on that question around sort of practicalities, like what can we do? There is a question around fair pay agreements. And, you know, for those who are not in Aotearoa and aren't quite sure what we're referring to here, there's a proposal to bring a fair pay agreement system where employers and unions from a sector will bargain for minimum terms and conditions for all employees in that industry or occupation. And there's a question from one of the attendees as to whether or not that would help address pay inequities. So Dennis, it would be great to hear your views on fair pay agreements.
Sure. I'm just going to put some context about the fair pay agreement. So this is basically an aspiration for us to introduce like an industry standard agreement in New Zealand, but it is actually negotiated by employers and the unions in particular sectors. Now, in terms of hitting the question or answering that, the fair pay agreement would actually address in terms of leveling the playing field of those businesses who are paying better or good wages versus businesses who are working in the same sector who are still actually giving or offering low paid wages to their workers. So that is the main idea of the fair pay agreement. And I think if ever we look at the fair pay agreement, there will be some statutory discussion points that will be discussed within the agreement, but there are some others that is still subject to negotiation between the employer or the employers and the unions or the workers. Now, my concern is that the fair pay agreement might actually fall short in addressing the gender and ethnic pay gap. And I think if ever we can incorporate the pay transparency and the reporting system, I think once we develop the negotiation process for the fair pay agreement, it might eventually address that, but I don't think it's going to be happening soon.
Thank you so much. Maretha, Nina, do you have any thoughts on the fair pay agreements that you'd like to share? No. Okay, so we have a set of questions that are very, I guess, critical to this conversation around intersectionality. You know, we're talking about changing the or impacting the empowerment, economic empowerment of women in the changing world of work. You know, this is the theme that we're really addressing here. But we can't really talk about ethnic and gender pay gaps without talking about racism. And this is something that has come up, you know, we've talked about it in other words like unconscious bias, conscious bias, structural and institutional, you know, racism and bias. But there are a few questions here about addressing that and acknowledging it in the workplace. How do we do it? How do we address it, I guess, at an individual level is one way, and also quite critically at the institutional level within our workplaces with leadership. So maybe Nina, could we hear a little bit about, I mean, you addressed it a little bit at the beginning, you know, this is also quite personal for many of us. So how would we address that? How can we empower ourselves and particularly women and women of color, BIPOC women to do this?
The question I'd like to answer, like, how can we solve racism? One of the most important learnings I've learned at university in the last few years is that racism is not people of color's problem. We're the victims of it, and it destroys us. But it's actually up to Pakeha It's up to those two people it's the people with the privilege and the power, and who find themselves on the opposite end of racism, to actually question themselves, confront their biases. First of all, acknowledge it, confront it, and make an action plan to change it, right? Oftentimes I'm really tired of like people who make it, yes, a collective effort is required, right? But we do have to acknowledge where the burden actually lies. Racism is deeply, deeply ingrained in New Zealand with our colonial history. The experiences of Māori Pacifica and now of migrants as well can attest to that. In terms of pay inequity, in particular in workspaces, organizations should take the lead in creating safe spaces for their employees. But also, here's where allyship comes in. And again, I'm talking to any Pakeha audiences. You have to be a good and genuine ally. For in a lot of organizations, because people of color don't have that bargaining power, and the culture of pay secrecy makes pay gaps worse, it's actually up to you to stand up to them. And in instances where you find that you're getting paid more than a colleague, for example, you had to be brave enough and be ballsy enough to say, hey, this is not right. You stand up for those who can't. And I think that's a very important takeaway lesson. If you do have that privilege and power, you have to use it and use your platforms to advocate for those who may not have the same.
Thank you so much. Saunoamaali'i, on the level of women's leadership, how would we address it in this is also something, Dennis, you mentioned in terms of leadership as well. How do we address racism and bias in that respect at all levels, I guess?
Yeah, my approach is, we as a person of color, as a woman, this is a common experience, but I like to think that that there are people who are not aware of their biases, and we work together. So, for example, if we're going to address, going to end pay secrecy, well, obviously, let's remove those secrecy clauses, like Dennis has said, that's in the contracts. People talk about their pay in the tea room anyway, and when they hang out at each other's children's birthday parties. And New Zealand is a small country, we're a village, really. It's hard to keep anything secret. So let's get rid of those nonsense things and free everybody to talk. It's their money in exchange for their talent. So why is it anybody's business what I do with my money, and who I tell that to? But certainly, let's just have systems that doesn't make assumptions about whether someone's racist or not. So let's record nation of origin in our databases. When we recruit people, we ask for their sex and their date of birth. Let's just ask for, if they have a disability that it might, may need to disclose so that we can support them. What is their nation of origin? So we're not making assumptions about people, but we're just saying, tell us a bit more about yourself. If you're going to attract and retain talent, as we said, transparency is going to count in terms of attracting that. But let's collect that data, and then that will give us then the ability to then, look, are there any gaps, in terms of moving people up the ladder? Isn't it, let's review as some boards do every 6 months. They go, we've had so many promotions. How many of those people are people who are not from New Zealand, for example? How many of those people are from our Indigenous peoples? Because then you ask these questions. And these are important. So we're not making assumptions that anyone is bad, but let's look at what's missing and who's not there. Because that's what we expect for all people. So that's how I think, those are simple things that we can do. Is this a good time to do this? Absolutely, it is a good time. When we raised it before, it's like, it's
seems like we've got a bit of technical difficulties.
To what we've created, and do right. So, thank you.
Yes, if I may, just
Please.
come in on the issue of racism, and I find that a fascinating conversation given my own personal background and history from South Africa, where that is a conversation that we've had over many, many decades. And interestingly enough, part of a lot of the work that I've done in South Africa prior to migration was in the space of transformation from that previously a very discriminatory apartheid kind of environment to a more democratic one. It took me migrating here to realize to what extent even the work that I've done in South Africa still came from a place of privilege, and to what extent I've still imposed quite a lot of those mindsets in doing that work. So that was quite a period of introspection and reflection for me in my journey here. Having said that, in the work that I'm doing at DiversityWorks, I speak to many, many leaders, many, many organizations. And I find the perspective here on racism to be a fascinating one. And the amount of times where leaders say to me, well, we don't have racism in New Zealand. And I respectfully disagree. But the sense here is one that, yes, we may have some colonial hangover that comes with structural and systems bias, why people may be difficult to progress. But in terms of overt racism, in terms of prejudice, in terms of bias, we are an egalitarian country and we don't have this in the country. And that for me is fascinating, because that is clearly not the case in terms of what we are seeing playing out in not just the data, but also in our conversations with individuals and how they perceive themselves and privilege. But it's also almost that sense of, unless we are, and here I want to use the Alcoholic Anonymous kind of analogy and go, unless we are able to go and put our hands up and say, we are racist, we do have biases, we're actually not even at the starting point yet. So it's about how do we get our people to understand what racism really looks like practically in our mindsets, and putting their hands up and understanding that something needs to be done about that before we can actually have the conversation about how we bridge those issues and gaps.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yes, we need to learn how to have these difficult conversations, don't we? And it starts with acknowledgement and being able to stand up and have and create spaces where those conversations can be had. I want to end with one question for all of you, which is really bringing it back to this question of women's empowerment, specifically women's economic empowerment. It's a general question, but it's really at the core of, I guess, this webinar and this panel, which is how does addressing ethnic pay equity help the economic empowerment of women specifically? And why does it matter? What are some final, if there was one final thought you'd like to leave us with, what would that be? Perhaps I'll start with Nina. Is there a final thought you'd like to share?
Yeah, so addressing pay gaps, at the heart of it, it's really critical to supporting ethnic women's aspiration and well-being. And Karanina touched on this earlier and in her video. Maori and Pacifica children are severely overrepresented in poverty statistics and almost every negative statistic in New Zealand. And ethnic communities find themselves in the same position. So for a lot of families, the money is dependent on women's wages. So raising this and empowering ethnic women to have these conversations and making safe spaces for them to achieve actual pay equity will help everyone, because it will trickle down to households and children's. And at the end of it, it's really about families, and that's what we keep emphasizing with Mind the Gap. It's not just numbers, it's actual pay packets. It's how many bread and milk you can buy. It's if you can afford groceries or gas for the week or not. So that difference, until we achieve pay equity and equity for all women, if it's not intersectional, it's not meaningful enough. It is not good enough. So yeah.
Incredibly powerful. Thank you, Nina. Dennis.
Well, I think a couple of things from me, and my word could be controversial. The first one is that I would like to see New Zealand's society actually breaking the taboo, especially the business sector, because there are still some businesses out there that they prefer to employ men because men don't use those maternity leave or parental leave. And that's a discussion that must have in the workplace, because I think as long as the mentality is like that, it's always discriminate the women. And I think for those who are in power, it's very important. If ever you really wanted to see change in your workplace, in your business, first you must accept that there is actually structural discrimination. Whether you inherit that, whether it was a conscious or unconscious bias, you have to start from your acknowledgement. Because I dealt with some chief executives and managing directors. They acknowledge that there is actually imbalance in terms of number of men and women, especially in the top management position. Now, it's good that you recognize that, but the second point is that how do you address that? Do you actually create a pathway for them to be part of that? And the way you can only create that pathway is that by creating a structure in order to make sure that women will also be empowered in the workplace. And I've seen that internationally, and I've seen that in the union movement. We actually corrected a lot of our practices, making sure that there is actually a pathway for those women and for those who are in that ethnic groups to be empowered to those leadership position. Because if ever you create that, then it will happen. But if ever you're just saying that because you would like to use that in marketing strategy, then I'm not going to be saying those words, which the word that you hate, that it's all blank, all right? Because it's not going to work, all right? And the other thing, in terms of my parting word that I would like to share to everyone is that this campaign for pay transparency, empowering women, and making sure that the broadening workforce will be addressed in New Zealand, addressing the low paid jobs. This is not to target actually ethnicity or another race. This is actually empowering those workforce or gender that are in a precarious situation in our society. And those of us who are in the position to do so must have a political will to make sure that this empowerment will actually happen.
Maretha, please.
And I think that I would like to use these final words just to link my thoughts to the question around the fair pay agreements. And I think for me, the issue is that what is it that we value? Women are overrepresented in those low-paying industries. And I think that fair pay agreements just on industry level itself is potentially not going to close the gap completely. It really begs the question about what we value. We say as people that our first priorities are looking after our children and after our health, but that doesn't actually translate into remuneration. When we talk about remuneration, we pay for IT specialists, we pay for investment analysts. So it really is about, as a nation, going, what is it that we value and what is it that we're going to pay for in terms of value? And we actually also need to look at that whole thing about women and people from ethnic communities being much more committed to that voluntary care, and how we actually get balance in terms of care responsibility. Because if we don't get that balance at home and in our communities, we won't be able to have the time available by those women and people from ethnic communities to contribute to the workplace in the way that people that don't have that care responsibility have. So it's about empowering women to have the discussion, and to have the discussion from a place of knowledge, and to have the conversation from a place of data. And that is why pay transparency is necessary.
Incredible. We can't speak about it if we don't speak about unpaid work and the value of it. Saunoamaali'i, please, your final words.
Yeah, I just say we've used our time, and gosh, we could talk for a much longer time. But I'll give my I suppose from my perspective, every single person matters. We all want to count, and there is a duty for us as a collective, as a family of humanity, to uplift each other, and certainly from a human rights perspective, to protect and uphold the rights of ourselves as well as of each other. And so transparency is one small step, but it's a significant step if we're looking at empowering women and ensuring equity and equality. So very, very important. I suppose in a time, this pandemic has really, in a way, has woken us up. We can't tolerate inequality anymore. We can't continue to leave people behind who were behind anyway. They're not even at the front line for the race, and we can't continue like that. And for a first world country, that's unacceptable. So this is our time. This is our moment to do better. And I certainly hope that our businesses and those who are making our laws in Parliament are hearing the call and not leaving it for another time. This is the time. Now that brings me back now to end our talanoa, our conversation today. Can I say thank you so much, Maretha and Dennis and Nina, for making the time to be here and sharing your knowledge. I'm feeling the love for the movement. So thank you so much. Thank you very much, Kat. Merci for facilitating our panel. And I wish everybody, wherever you are, morning, evening, afternoon, night, to please look after yourselves and all the best to you and your family. And I'm going to say a few words in our Indigenous language here, language of our tangata whenua, our Māori people here, to bless us as before we go. Kia tau te rangi Māori ki runga I a tātou katoa. Let peace reign over all of us. Ruia, 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 ruia. Break, dash, and crash the waves. Ruia ki runga, ruia ki raro. Up high and down low. Ruia ki waho, ruia ki roto. Across the outer reaches and depth within. Ruia ki uta, ruia ki tai. To the hinterland and far out to sea. Huana ki te rangi, turuana ki nuku. Rising to rangi and falling upon nuku. Na, kua tau, kua mau, kua ea. The lands are still, it is done. Tihei Moriora. Behold, 'tis the breath of life. Obrigada, salamat. Topkan ka, faftai lava. Be well.
Kataka te po, ka whiti te rā, ka mahara ke I toko renga, ka tangi te manu, nui a tāne, hoki atu rā ki te pō kere kere, e rangi nui, mana ki tia mai rā,